Welcome to the Blackstone Games Overview. Before we begin focusing on games, I want to make sure we have a few basic facts straight. The exam format is as depicted on the board. You're going to have section 1, 2, 3, each 35 minutes, 15-minute break, sections 4, 5, and then the essay, which is essentially section 6. One of these 5 sections, first 5 sections, will be what people call games. Analytical reasoning is the official name for them. 2 of them will be based on logic. Logical reasoning is what they're called. And 1 of them will be reading comprehension. Now there will also be a section that is experimental, meaning they're pre-testing questions for an upcoming exam, usually at least a year ahead. And you won't know where that section is. It could be any of your 1 to 4 sections. They've never done 5. It's always been 1, 2, or 3, and occasionally 4. So we just need to do our best on all 5 multiple choice sections, knowing only 4 count though. Now, games gets a lot of attention because people do not have background in games. So most above average college graduates like yourselves can read and think and process fairly well. So the logic is read a paragraph, answer a question, think, reading comp, read a passage, answer 6, 7 questions per passage, think. Those are skills that are somewhat in place at this point for most people. They need to be refined and specialized for this test, however. Games, on the other hand, is something people do not have background on, typically at all. And so it's a section that causes a lot of frustration and a good amount of anxiety. The other thing with games is that we have to perform in those. Like with logic and reading comp, we're just reading, assessing the answer choices, and making a decision. With games, we have to draw a diagram, and that is much more proactive. So it's unfamiliar and much more proactive, causing this section in a time that in which you have to do it is very short. Causes this section to create some worry. Now, we want to clear that up as best we can. As we see the games, they can all be played. That's what we like to call them. Played in one of 10 ways. And so we're going to do an example of each of those 10 approaches to the games. And of those 10, 4 are very rigid, and 6 are not rigid. So we're going to do the 4 rigid types, boxy, we call them, boxy games first, and then we're going to look at the 6 not boxy types. Now, an LSAT game can be thought of in a fun way of like an old-fashioned board game. In an old-fashioned game, you'd have a game board. And this is the zone that the game would be played in. Could be analogized to a baseball diamond, a football field, a basketball court, the zone in which we play. Okay? Now, on that field or in that zone will be moving pieces. We call these players. All LSAT games have 5 to 15 moving pieces, players on the field. And they're going to move in the organizer according to rules, like any game. LSAT games have typically 4 to 8 rules, telling us how the players are going to move. They will name the players, they will give us the rules, but they will not give us the organizer. That's what concerns people too. You have to draw something. What they will do is give you clues as to how you might draw an organizer. Now, if we were to actually buy an old-fashioned game, open up the game board, and all we had on here was a sticky note with clues as to how you might want to draw it, it would be defective, you know? That's not what we want. We want a game board. But on the LSAT, that's what we're going to have to do. Every game is presented on 2 pages. Game, first question, and the other questions over here. All games have 5, 6, or 7 questions to be answered based on the information provided. And that's going to be clues, players, and rules. And you have the bottom of 2 pages in which to draw your organizer and answer questions. Now, looking at our little diagram here, when we read that initial paragraph, the players will be named. And as I just said, there's going to be 5 to 15 players in every game. There will be several clues. We're going to need to learn to interpret those. Sometimes there's a rule buried in the descriptive paragraph. Usually the rules are indented, and we always suggest, of course, you use your pencil as you're reading, underline the names of players, underline keywords and clues, number your rules as you read, and while you're doing that, your mind is processing the information that's coming in, and you're doing a thing we call making inferences. Inferences are truths that we know that were not stated. Knowing what the clues said and reading the rules, we can know some additional information that's going to be very useful. Skilled game players are more proficient at making inferences, and so that will come along as you have more practice. Initially, we're doing well just to read carefully, ferret out the clues and interpret them correctly, and draw an organizer. So it's from these clues that we're going to get language that's going to tell us how to draw an organizer. We want to, practice, of course, but we need insight first, which is why we're doing this. So let's say that you were to read these clues, and the clues said this: 5 law students, their names are A, B, C, D, and E, are each the sole occupant of one of 5 consecutively numbered townhouses on Campus Street. What do we see in our mind's eye? It's very important to visualize. Do we see 5, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 townhouses? That's the main clue. That's the organizational clue. The townhouses are fixed. The people are moving. So if we read that, we'd say, oh, okay. So you mean we've got house 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Because remember, the clue said 5 consecutively numbered townhouses. We would draw an organizer like this. These players are going to move. They move in the organizer, which is also, we call it the game board. And of course, this is fixed. Okay. Now, let's say the rules said this. Let's say rule 1 says A lives in house 1 or house 5. What we want to do is a thing we call number and shorthand every rule, so we can work with it efficiently and accurately. So if they said A lives in house 1 or 5, we would want to write, okay, rule 1, A1 or A5. That's what we call a shorthand. Now, that's a very common rule, and when you know where a player is, as this one tells us, the most efficient thing to do is to make a picture of that, because these games are very visual. and we need to see the action happening in our mind's eye. It's going to help us play. So we would suggest you also put an A in 1 and an A in 5 so you can visualize this process. We call that little pattern A and little pattern B. Now, let's say that rule 2 says that B does not live next door to A. Does not. You could write that out, but that would be silly. It's already written out. So what we would do is we'd number and shorten that. B, we use a slash, not next to A. Little simple. Not adjacent. Since in this organizer there are 5 consecutive townhouses, slash means not next door to. Okay? Now, the only thing better than knowing where a player is where a player isn't. Now, do we know that A is in 1 or 5 from rule 1? Yeah, we do. If A is in 1, what do we know about 2 from rule 2? Not B. So put a not B in 2. We also know if A is in 5, what do you know about 4? Not B. Same thing, not B. Okay. And that's what we should do with 2. Now what we just did is we made an inference. We took the rule that says A is in 1 or 5, made a note of it, we made note of the rule B is not next to A, and we said, wow, so if A is in 1, B is not in 2. An inference is a very safe, unstated truth. And the games are full of them. In fact, every single correct answer in any game you play will be an inference from the information you have and the information that's provided. So we're always thinking, thinking, thinking. We can think of inferences as just being logical and thinking for the time being. We'll dig into those more deeply when we do logic, more formally. Well, let's say rule 3 says that C and D live immediately next door to each other, CD. We have to know that unless they say, and C is in a lower numbered house than D, that that's reciprocal. It could be CD or DC. Okay? So we want to make a picture, CD or DC. To remind yourself when you look at that, because when you write it, you're going to own it. And actually what helps us play the games faster is owning the rules. The sooner we can properly interpret and own the rules, we can use them more efficiently. So a lot of times people don't want to invest in this rule diagramming. And in fact, if you don't, you're going to have to keep going back to what they said. Once you make a picture, you own it. So this tells us that CD are adjacent houses. Now, would it be efficient to pop that into our organizer? No, it wouldn't. Because CD could be 2, 3, 3, 4, or 4, 5 in pattern A, and then they could be reversed, DC, DC, DC. So that would be 6 designs. That would be very inefficient. And of course in pattern B, CD, 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 3 ways, and then the reverse, DC, 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 another 6. That would be 12 pictures for something that's a very simple truth. So we need to know when to plug in. Like we would plug in A, rule 1, excuse me, A 1 or 5. We would note the inference from rule 2. We leave rule 3 out. It's not worth it. Let's say there's one more rule. Rule 4 says that E does not live in house 4. Okay, so we go to house 4 and we put a not E. We don't know where E is, but we know where it isn't. It's not 4. We build that one in. So what's hanging out mostly is this big CD rule. Now, what we have up here right now is what we call setup. And we want to do this with every game. Read it very carefully all the way through once. Ask yourself, what is fixed and what is moving? If you feel the information provided is workable for you, it's efficient for you to do now, you jump on that game under time conditions. That means you reread it now, underlining, marking, and thinking about the picture in your head. And then you need to say, okay, what's fixed and what's moving? Here, what's fixed? 1 through 5, houses, okay? They're stationary. The people are moving. We've numbered the rules, plugged them in, and now you would answer your question 1 from here down. So you have this information in front of you to work with all the rules that are, that are rigid in place. And you can always reference that as well. And save your work. As you move down, save correct patterns so you can refer back to those is an efficient strategy. Now, this particular design is a type of game we call linear. We mentioned here that we see 10 ways of organizing the games, and linear is the name we have given to this particular style of organizer. In linear games, you have one type of player, and they are lined up. Some people like to call these or think of these as ordering games, sequencing games. We call them linear when we first named them when the games came out in '82. And all those names are good. It's the idea that players are lined up, one in front of, one behind the other. One row of boxes is the linear organizer. And linear games make up 20 to 25% of all the games that have ever been tested on the LSAT. So the chance of having a linear game on any exam is extremely high. Since you have 4 games in your game section, one of them being linear or linear mixed with something else is very, very likely.